to a PWI? I don't think you can, not all PWIs are big, but the ones out, like Ohio State and Texas are like two of the biggest in the country. So I can't, it's hard to say except for that, right? Because the size is probably the most, the thing that gave me the most culture shock being there. I think that the major difference though is in many ways, from here to Ohio State, the way that faculty interacted with students was a little bit different. And in some ways, like this notion of an ethic of care wasn't there in the same way. Like I had very specific mentors and pockets that I could find that I got directed to, that supported me and loved on me through the process. And overall, it was a really good experience. But there are those traps in interacting with people who don't necessarily understand what it means to like care for a student as they go through the process. I'll never forget, there was one faculty member who sent an email out to all the Asian students to do his gardening. And it was crazy because sometimes like an advisor will look out for you and say, and you know, they'll have something at their house, a barbecue, they'll feed you or whatever. And there were times where, you know, stuff like that happened, and it wasn't just, it was racist because he wasn't just looking at his students, he like selected all the Asian students of all the people who had students who were there because it's the idea that they're more docile and they won't challenge, you know, the authority, even though he was going to pay them, right? He picked out those students to do those things. And as well-meaning as some faculty members may be, the instance where you have these lowered expectations where you tell students don't take this class. And it's those subtle forms of racism that are the lower expectations that we run into. I also think one of the major differences is that the students are different who are there. A lot of times the students who have a total PWI experience, I think in some ways they get worn out and exhausted being in those environments. They're much more sensitive to like microaggressions and things like that. And so while I was at the University of Texas, I wasn't thinking about the statue of the white supremacists. You know what I mean? Like it just, I mean, it's important and it's an issue to deal with, but I wasn't losing sleep over that or felt the need to necessarily protest because I was there to get my PhD and I was working on other things. And so there are other sort of distractions, I think, that students who have that total PWI experience that you won't necessarily encounter here. And it makes you a little bit more aware of the racism and whatnot that's in the academy. But it also sort of gave me tools to navigate and be more aware of those systems and whatnot. So the money is also a huge factor too, because the gap in the resources is tremendous. Somebody else?
Can you speak to, sometimes there's a prevailing stereotype that coming from an HBCU, it causes you to experience what some of your colleagues experience of that lowered expectation. Can you speak to your preparation from being an HBCU and an A&T graduate that said when you got to Ohio State that you were not underprepared but well prepared to excel wherever you were, to kind of defeat that false narrative?
So one, I think transitioning from an HBCU to a PWI for graduate school, for those faculty members and people who work in higher education, I think they know that people from HBCUs typically do very well when they go to graduate school. So I don't know if you come necessarily with that stigma, because in some ways, like, you're one of the ones that have been chosen, right, to go to the next step. For me, A&T provided a tremendous experience as an undergraduate student. I was getting opportunities to study abroad. I think when study abroad wasn't the thing to do here or in other schools around the country, I went to Brazil, they sent me to Puerto Rico, but also in the classroom, and I have to give a shout out to my academic advisor at the time, Dr. Webb, was very rigorous in terms of the way that it was structured with the conversations we had were much like graduate school. So I wasn't in a room where there was 500 people. In some cases, there might have been 10, 12, 20 of us, but we were having like very deep conversations about concepts dealing with education and teaching practices. We read journal articles while I was an undergraduate, and that's not something necessarily that everybody gets at other institutions. So the classroom climate and environment that was created in terms of the conversations was much like it was when you get to graduate school. Because in grad school, you can't hide. You can't hide behind the 500 people that are in class. Like, you actually have to talk, and A&T gave me that opportunity. So I would say, as a student who went to what would be like a PWI high school, that was like a very elite public high school. I wasn't a great student, but I had like all these other identities, right? I was the cool black kid who was still black. I was an athlete. I did like the Mr. South pageant at my high school, which was like, you know, you represent the school and whatnot. But here, it gave me the opportunity to be a nerd, because there were other people filling that void. Like, I wasn't a student athlete, so we had student athletes. Everybody's black, so I didn't have to be the black kid that was still black, but everybody liked. Like, I could sit back and like really just be a nerd for the first time, and I think that that's the main thing that sort of catapulted me to be ready for graduate school at these PWIs, or anywhere for that matter.
So what are you doing now?
So right now, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio. In my 4th year, planning on going up for tenure early. There are some other things like outside of the academy that I'm proud of, like having the opportunity to come back here and talk and speak, and even doing certain things in the community in San Antonio as well. So.
Did you always want to go into academia, or did you consider the industry?
So my industry would be teaching. So I did teach. I taught for 2 years before, I taught a year master's degree. I taught a year PhD. So I was in the industry, and in some ways I still am. But I'm even thinking about now that there are opportunities outside of academia where you don't necessarily have to be pigeonholed into a tenure track position or anything like that. So.
Did you do a postdoc?
No.
Could you talk about some of the value of participating in professional organizations to developing your materials that you needed for tenure?
Participating in professional organizations is valuable because it allows you to have connections with people around the country, and also to get your name out there. In some ways, I think it's overrated, to be honest. They don't always, I think you have to find a professional organization that is of benefit to you and not necessarily wants you to be a benefit to them. And there's a difference between those types of professional organizations. So for me, going to conferences is a large part of the joy of being an academic or in graduate school. Because sometimes, I mean, if you want to get out of Greensboro for a little while, find a conference that's in LA and go to LA for a week and have A&T pay for you to go out there and go see Hollywood for the first time, right? Or there's an international conference that's part of an organization. So you might go to South Africa or Spain or something like that. Those are some of the benefits of being in professional organizations. And so I think of it as leveraging those memberships to create a better experience for you, and not just be the type of person who gets used up by the organizations just to make the organization more viable, such that it's not necessarily a benefit to yourself. Who is struggling with joy in grad school? That's what I want to know, right? And that's really what I wanted to talk about, because the crazy thing is that everyone was telling me how awesome it is to get a PhD, but when I got there, everybody was depressed. And part of that is like the culture and the ethos and the environment that you're put in. It's like the standard is unhappiness, right? And so like you just gotta remember, it's just like being in school again. You might not be making the same amount of money, but you can still go out and have some fun. Like you can still be on a flag football team, you can still play fantasy football, you can hang out with your family, your kids, your boys, your homegirls, or whoever. it doesn't have to be this thing that just wears you out simply because everybody says it's a thing that wears you out.
To that point, you made a specific point to say, you know, you had your PhD guy that was like a mentor for you, and him saying, I wouldn't do this if I had the opportunity again. You made a decision to be different.
Right.
Can you speak to maybe a low point that you had to overcome that was trying to take your joy, or do you think you kept it high the entire time, relatively speaking?
So, the last 2 years of the PhD program I was in, we found out my father had cancer. So from the last 2 years of the PhD program to my first year on my job at UT San Antonio, my dad was dying. And in that time, someone in here has had a family member that died of cancer. So y'all know how it is, right? One day they're good, and the next day they got to go to the hospital. They come back, they're good, then they go back to the hospital, and it's like this roller coaster ride. Because they got all these new medicines, right? But unfortunately, a lot of times they just don't work. Eventually it's going to catch up to you. So it was like that with my dad. So my dad went to the hospital, in and out of hospitals, got lung cancer. My brother's schizophrenic. So my brother's wilding, right? So he's out in Philadelphia somewhere. So my dad's got cancer. He drives out to Philadelphia and finds my brother on the street randomly by the grace of God. Brings him back home. So my dad's dying at home. My brother's crazy at home. And then moving forward at some point, my dad was in the hospital, got better. My mom had a heart attack. So like all of these things are happening while I'm in graduate school. But at the same time, like I don't ever really remember being depressed or really down, because I had a great environment of mentors and people at the University of Texas at Austin, a church community, and just people outside of the academy who could really like love on me and care for me in ways that like wouldn't necessarily happen if I didn't have that. So that whole piece about relating is key to like maintaining your joy while you're in graduate school.
Let's give them another round of applause.